I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to a video conference edition of the New York Times Close Up. You might call Donald Trump the schoolyard bully these days. He's pressuring school districts to fully reopen by fall and threatening to cut federal funding if they don't. Health experts and teachers' unions warn that reopening could be risky. In the country's biggest school district, New York City, Mayor de Blasio is planning for only a partial reopening, with kids going 1 to 3 days a week. Governor Cuomo will probably have the final say. LA and San Diego schools will be online only this fall. As for Trump's threat to cut funds, the Times wrote, quote, "In reality, the threat may be hollow. The president has no control over about 90% of school district budgets, which are generally financed by local property and sales taxes. And he has little control over federal funding already appropriated by Congress." But Trump seems intent on turning schools reopenings into a campaign issue. He tweeted, quote, "The Dems think it would be bad for them politically if U.S. schools open before the November election, but it is important for the children and families may cut off funding if not open." So how will this play out? Erica Green has been covering the story for the New York Times. And Erica, you pointed out the other day in the Times that Betsy DeVos, the education secretary, seems to want it both ways. She has been preaching for a long time local control over the schools. Now she says that the federal government should mandate that schools reopen, the argument being that it's good for students, it's good for parents, it's good for teachers, and of course it's good for the economy. So how does she reconcile these positions?
They haven't really reconciled both of these positions yet. I mean, we're waiting for some clarity from the education department about this, mandate to reopen or else. I do have a feeling that more may be coming on that, given that they have not identified any pots of funding through which they will leverage the 10% of federal funding that flows from the federal government to states. There are a few options, but she has not been clear. And it's been striking to those in the education community because Betsy DeVos for 3 years, and even if you look at her advocacy before then, has taken a back seat. And even with the coronavirus response, she was not a member of the coronavirus task force, which was also really interesting. And now she's become the face of it. So how she's using her bully pulpit is quite contradictory to how she's led the department. And so far, it's not clear whether she just thinks that in-person should be an option or the actual rule, which is what she said so far.
Erica, what is the argument in favor of opening the schools? What are the pluses in doing that?
I mean, I think educators, researchers, scientists, pediatricians all agree. Everyone in the child welfare industry agrees that this has taken a potentially devastating academic, physical, and emotional toll on the nation's most vulnerable children. Given that there isn't much data about how the virus affects children, and given that they have obviously been the population that has not seen a spike in cases or deaths, it just, everyone's looking for the best way to do this, because what we are seeing is Black, minority, special education children falling really, really far behind their peers, and they were behind arguably already. So having them back in the classroom definitely has its advantages. And there are a bunch of social supports that children receive in school beyond instruction, right? We have mental health services, basic necessities like food, and supervision. So children rely heavily on schools in this country to meet their basic needs. And it's been really, no one can argue. I think everyone can agree, no matter where you fall on the political spectrum or otherwise, that them being away from school for another, year or month or day is going to have a detrimental effect.
The president obviously has made a priority of jumpstarting the economy, something a lot of people agree is important. But why has he been out front in the vanguard of this movement to reopen schools and reopen them fully? How important is that to the economy? Does he care so much about the academic socialization impact?
It's been interesting to watch the president wade into this issue, given that education has not been at the forefront of anything he's really done in the past few years. It's been a side note in State of the Union addresses, and that's about it. So, there was research early on as the schools started to shut down that 1 month of schools and childcare centers being closed would cost the economy $50 billion. And as this has drawn out, I think everyone's multiplying that each month. And so the fact of the matter is states can reopen all they want, bars can reopen all they want, restaurants, businesses, but if parents cannot get back to work because they are at home with their children, either homeschooling them themselves or supervising virtual instruction, it's going to impact the economy. It was actually interesting to see him come out against virtual instruction, which Betsy DeVos has actually championed throughout her career, and actually during the pandemic has devoted funding to states actually creating virtual schools. So to see him come out against virtual instruction, I think further shows just how important kids being out of the home in a classroom is to the administration. And it's truly because there is no way that parents can go back to work if their children are at home.
Obviously, there was no time for any kind of pilot test or experimentation, but has virtual education, has this distance learning seemed to work? Is there any way of telling whether in below college level, this seems to be having any impact?
I mean, there isn't a body of research on that yet, and I'm sure we will see it. I know there are several groups across the country working on it. But the reality is, and to be completely honest, virtual learning has kind of been a disaster in most districts. Whether it's the 30 minutes of instruction that children are getting a day to the digital divide where children are not logging on at all. It has not, I don't think anyone can say that on the whole, virtual instruction has gone well during this time. School districts, just were not prepared to have to teach thousands and thousands of children through a computer. And so, there is an argument to be made that school districts did not rise to the challenge, and this cannot continue in the fall, which we have seen the Secretary of Education make. I mean, she has quoted statistics showing that districts just could not get this right for a number of weeks. So it's interesting that the message isn't find a way to do this better or else. It is reopen schools or else.
The
So
president has taken responsibility away from the Centers for Disease Control. How much power, how much authority is he going to give the Department of Education in enforcing go back to school?
unclear. It seems like he's not providing guidance, he's providing a mandate. And so from, my sources, it seems that they are really looking at all of their options for how to penalize schools that don't offer full-time instruction and don't offer in-class instruction as an option. And so, there is something to be said for the fact that, yes, on the whole, the federal government does not control the vast majority of school budgets. But we have to remember that the education department can revoke funding if schools do not meet their state requirements for the level of instruction or the number of hours of instruction. They can revoke funding if schools don't meet their mandates under if they do not meet their mandates of federal civil rights laws. So if, for example, a school district is not providing special education services to students under their virtual plans, that's a violation of the law. And school districts have been, investigated and penalized for falling down on those requirements for years, for decades. So they do have a few avenues. What we don't know is which ones they are exploring at this moment.
And just how far they'll go. Erica Green of the New York Times, thanks so much for joining us. And coming up next, the Trump playbook, is it backfiring? It looks like Donald Trump has decided to ignore many of his political advisors and go with the instincts that got him elected in 2016. He's stoking racial and cultural divisions on an almost daily basis. He went after NASCAR, a favorite sport of his base, for banning the Confederate flag. He even attacked NASCAR's leading Black driver. When New York City decided to paint Black Lives Matter in front of Trump Tower, he called it a symbol of hate. This Times headline summed it up. Trump is selling white grievance. The suburbs aren't buying it. He's asking the Supreme Court to strike down Obamacare, ignoring the fact that more than 20 million Americans would lose health insurance in the midst of a deadly pandemic. Nicknames are an old Trump favorite, but the ones he's called Joe Biden haven't been sticking. Meanwhile, Trump brazenly commuted the prison sentence of his pal Roger Stone. Are the tactics of the Trump 2016 playbook backfiring, except with his most hardcore base? And how does Joe Biden take advantage of the situation? Clyde Haberman is a contributing writer to the New York Times. Johanna Barr is a senior politics editor, and Jonathan Ellis, also a senior politics editor. The president seems to have a tin ear about the virus, calling for schools to reopen, a withdrawal from the World Health Organization, wearing a mask only that one time that he's had to, holding the Republican convention almost on schedule, except maybe outdoors. Clyde Haberman, how is the president reacting to this, and why so when so many Americans seem concerned about the pandemic?
Sam, it's more than just a tin ear, I would argue, but a murderously tin ear. I mean, people are dying by the tens of thousands. They're certainly getting this virus by the many tens of thousands. This is a very anti-science administration. He is an anti-science person. If the reality is not his perception of what it is, he rejects it entirely. And what distresses an awful lot of people, I include myself in them, is that his followers seem to be blindly going along, even on just the simple issue of wearing a mask. I don't know anybody who likes to wear the mask. It is annoying, it is sweat producing, it is a pain in the neck. It does seem to help. It is not a big deal. This should not be part of the culture wars, but he's made every aspect of our modern life part of this endless culture war. And it is destructive and at this point lethal.
Clyde, when we see the virus surging, though, in states that might well be part of his base and have been, isn't there the potential of that backfiring?
I guess, but you said before, look, his hardcore is never going to leave. He was right when he said 4 years ago, was it, that I could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and I wouldn't lose a single vote. That's been proven because he has metaphorically shot a lot of people on Fifth Avenue through his behavior during this pandemic. At the moment, all the polls show he can't possibly win. But then again, we were saying that at roughly this time and even later back in 2016. So we had a very good story by Matt Flagenheimer the other day about how he used he turned the whole Access Hollywood debacle to his favor by, among other things, rounding up the Bill Clinton accusers, the women who accused him of bad behavior. He'll do that and he'll do worse. There's nothing that he won't do. And now he has folks like Roger Stone who would be more than willing to help him and others. It's going to be a long way between now and November 3rd.
Johanna, Brett Stevens wrote in the Times the other day that the Democrats' Achilles heel in this election is a far left fringe that may be relatively small but highly visible. Is there going to be a backlash to that fringe? Do you think that redounds to Trump's benefit? The polls, as Clyde says, are not in the president's favor, but the election is still a long way off.
I don't think that that really sort of holds up to the polling that we're seeing and some of the demographic shifts that we're seeing, where lots of the party is actually moving far left on a number of issues, and so is Joe Biden. He hasn't fully gone Bernie Sanders, but he and Bernie Sanders had a joint task force where they, allies of both of them came together on a bunch of these policy proposals, and came out with a further to the left than he had originally been on a number of issues. New platform for his campaign. I think the concerns for Democrats are in terms of ballot access and whether or not people are going to be able to go to the polls, whether or not voting by mail is going to be allowed, and whether or not there will be attempts to continue to purge people from the rolls and make it more difficult to cast a ballot. But there's clear energy on the Democratic side. You're seeing that with the fundraising from most of the Democratic Senate candidates. The Republicans are only just starting to release their numbers and open their books, but millions upon millions of dollars in states where Democrats were not competitive in past years. So I do think there's a shift happening in that direction.
But when the president is once again stoking racial divisions himself, is there more of a likelihood that will backfire, or is the so-called cancel culture more likely to backfire? Which plays better with the majority of Americans at this point?
I mean, the majority of Americans have, said in polls and in our stories, our reporting shows that people, including in the suburbs, including older voters who, maybe went for Trump in the past, older white voters, are not really buying this attempt to totally dismiss the lived experience of Black Americans in this country, and other people of color in this country as well. More and more people, realize that Black people are disproportionately hurt and killed by the police, despite what the president said yesterday. More and more people are joining these protests. It is, of course, possible that there's going to be a backlash to the backlash, but the idea that is going to have enough strength to shift anything back in the other direction is not really proven out yet at this point, from what we can see.
Don't people lie on polls when it comes to race, though?
I mean, of course they do. Some people want to look better. We can't rely entirely on the polls this year. We learned that in 2016, but this is what our reporting is showing so far.
Jonathan, Mary Trump's book came out the same day that the president held what was supposed to be a press conference. Peter Baker reported that it was a strange, rambling 63-minute monologue almost that sort of conflicted with his own assessment of himself as a very stable genius. What was on the president's mind, do you think?
Well, it was clear that the president took what had been billed as a White House Rose Garden news conference and quickly turned that into essentially something of a campaign rally in front of the journalists who were there that could have been making up for his canceled rally over the weekend in New Hampshire. But, I think it's another example of the president playing to his base, his supporters, people who watch President Trump at his rallies on Fox News. I think there's a certain set of lingo that the president, will frequently use, and it's almost shorthand that his supporters respond to, and they kind of know what he's talking about. And people who don't watch a lot of Trump rallies may have no idea what some of what he's talking about is. I think the problem there for Mr. Trump is that it doesn't really serve to expand his base of support. He's really speaking to his base. He's preaching to the choir. But the problem is, it seems like he needs to expand a little bit beyond that to be able to improve his poll numbers at this point.
Clyde, I'm not sure you read that Mary Trump book, but it did get what I thought was a surprisingly solid review in the New York Times. Did we learn anything new about the president from that?
Well, it filled in some parts of the family background. I think we already knew that the Trump family is about as dysfunctional as it can get and still be very high achieving. It's quite extraordinary. And I would argue it continued to a third generation. Donald Trump Jr. is I've often on Twitter described, I have a little bit more freedom in my more emeritus capacity these days as a combination of Fredo and Sonny Corleone. I mean, he's both thuggish and unbelievably stupid. Eric isn't much better. If I could, though, not to dismiss your question, but Johanna referred to mail voting by mail and so on. If I can localize this for a second, it is now more than 3 weeks since New York had its primary, and we still do not have those votes counted. It is outrageous, even allowing for a certain period before the counting could begin. I think it's roughly a week. This makes no sense. And this is a recurring pattern in our city where the Board of Elections is just endlessly hopeless. And I don't know what that portends for November. It may not be as important in New York, which is clearly going to overwhelmingly vote for Biden. But if this is going to be recurring in some of the states that really do matter this time around, we've got problems.
Johanna, if the president's poll numbers are not great, and as Clyde pointed out, they weren't great for the Republican, when others were running also, and it is a long time until the election. How does he move beyond that base? How does he cross a threshold where he is ahead of Joe Biden and ahead, obviously, in the states that really count? He's got to expand beyond that base. How does he do it if these tactics don't seem to be working?
I would say, moving beyond the politics of division and working to embrace the scientific consensus on the coronavirus, and showing that he is taking it seriously. Neither of which we've seen any evidence that he's heading in that direction, but also, if the economy is to surge back in some sort of way, and he is able to frame that and, as if that was because of his actions and take responsibility for, good economic news and maybe help some of the many, many, many people in this country who are struggling right now, I could see, the pendulum swinging back in his direction. But the framing would have to be correct, I would say.
Jonathan, obviously, there's a lot of time, as we've been saying, for things to happen that we don't expect. But do we think there's going to be any backlash to the Roger Stone act on the part of the president? And also, there have been calls for Anthony Fauci to quit, to step down and say, I've had enough of this bullying by the president, even though I've been rather calm about it. Are things like that likely to influence the election?
I think that there's just so much is known among the electorate about President Trump that I'm not sure that anything related to, let's call it personnel, whether that be Roger Stone or Dr. Fauci, is really going to move the needle very much at this point. I think that one key thing to look at is sort of the polling that shows how Americans who dislike both of the candidates feel. And one of the things that really helped Donald Trump in 2016 was that among the voters who disliked both candidates, he really took the lion's share of that vote. I guess he was sort of seen as the lesser of two evils, you could say. And this time around, people who dislike both of the candidates say that they, overwhelmingly say that they would vote for Joe Biden rather than Mr. Trump. So, I'm not sure that that a lot of minds are going to be changed, whether he's going after, or his administration is going after Dr. Fauci, or whether he's commuting the sentence of Roger Stone. I think that all sort of plays into the image that everyone already has of the president, for good or ill. And I think as Johanna was saying, it would require more of a tonal shift from the White House to really potentially change things. Or again, to piggyback off what she was saying, one of the strongest issue for the president in polling is the economy. People still believe that he can do a good job on the economy. So we will see what happens over the next couple of months to see if that might change things.
And of course, when you talk about lesser alternatives and lesser evils, we don't have a third alternative as strong as we did in the last time around either. Thanks to Clyde Haberman, Johanna Barr, Jonathan Ellis for joining us from the New York Times. And for the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.